Hey Year 11. So this lesson is going to be about writing narratives for your coursework. You might remember that we did already do a piece of narrative writing coursework at the end of Year 10 when we did our taster class. But since it's been so long, and also I think your writing ability has improved a lot since then, I think it's important that we do another piece so that we've got two pieces of narrative coursework to choose from. A narrative, remember, means a story. So, as you watch this video, you should summarise my points about the mark scheme, read all of the example stories and decide what mark they would get and why. And then at the end, I want you to pick a story idea and begin thinking about what you will write. So you don't need to start writing anything yet, but just start gathering your ideas, start thinking about different things that you could write, different characters, different settings, and so on. So we're going to start off then by having a look at the mark scheme. So I've given you a copy of this mark scheme already, but let's take a closer look at it. So you actually get 2 marks. You get 1 mark out of 10, which is for content and structure, and 1 mark out of 15, which is for style and accuracy. Let's take a look at content and structure first. So, to get 9 or 10 out of 10, you need to have content, your story, that is complex, complicated, engaging and effective. So basically it is an enjoyable and effective story. To me that means it makes the reader feel something. It might make me feel sad, surprised, angry, scared, and that sometimes when I'm reading it I forget that it's a story, it's that well written. The structure is secure, well balanced and carefully managed for deliberate effect. What that means to me is that you're using paragraphs and you're using them consciously to create an effect. You've got that clear narrative structure where you're starting off with your exposition, your setting, your character, you're building slowly up that plot mountain to the climax. You've got a very clear climax, and you might choose to end it on a cliffhanger, or you might choose to wrap it up to resolve the story. So if we look a little bit more closely at what it says for narrative, to get that top mark, the plot is well defined and strongly developed with features of fiction writing such as description, characterization, and effective climax and convincing details. So you've got some description, maybe of setting, with some language devices and so on. You've got a sense of characterization, so you should have at least 2 characters, and I should be able to tell you really what they look like and what their personalities are like, also what their motivations are, what are their goals. You have got an effective climax and convincing details. That to me might mean a little bit of dialogue, or it might mean some small subplots or something like that. Let me just remind you of narrative structure. You have seen this a load of times, but I just really want to make sure that it's very, very clear in your head. So hopefully you remember looking at this plot mountain. This is the structure of a story. So you start off with your introduction. Usually that's where you're introducing setting, characters and character motivation. Then your rising action, so that's when the plot starts to happen. Usually that means that there's going to be some sort of obstacle or problem for your character. The climax, which means the peak point of your story where the tension and excitement is the highest. That might be finding out who finally committed the murder. It might be the big battle, so it's that big moment in the story. Because it's a short story, some people choose to end their stories quite close after this, or leave it on what we call a cliffhanger, a mysterious ending where perhaps things aren't quite resolved. Or you can also have the falling action where you answer some questions, you show what happens at the end, and a resolution. Now for CIE, what they're most bothered about is this climax. If your story doesn't have a climax, you're not going to get into that top band. It has to have a climax, it has to have character, it has to have setting. So those are the things that we should be focusing on. Let's go back to the mark scheme. So That's what I mean when I say effective climax. So the next band is similar, but whereas here it's complicated, engaging and effective, down here it's developed, engaging and effective. It's well managed, it's not necessarily done for deliberate effect, and some of it is done for deliberate effect. So this is like 90% success, whereas this is more like 75-80% success. But notice that to get into this band, you still need to have description, characterization, and climax. But here, you don't have those convincing details. So that's kind of the difference. When I've been marking this paper, most students will get around a 7. 6 or 7 is the average. So for a 6, which could be quite common, is that the content is relevant, so you have written a story and it is developed and there is some sense of structure, like you have got some paragraphs but maybe it's not completely effective, maybe sometimes it's a little bit boring or confusing to read. Up here your story's really clear, I understand what's happening, you've got a character, you've got climax, it might not be the most exciting thing I've ever read but it's clear. Up here it's very clear and very effective and interesting. So interesting, clear but a little bit boring, and here is when it starts to get a bit more confusing. So you've got some character, some setting, but notice you haven't got that climax anymore. So if you don't have a climax, you're going to get a 6 or lower. I don't think any of you will get down here, but let's briefly talk about it. This is when the story is very straightforward, so quite childlike, like a 6 or 7-year-old is writing it. You've got some paragraphs but not always, and your structure isn't always effective. The plot is straightforward, so I can kind of understand what's happening, but there's not a lot of features of narrative writing. There's no setting, there's no character, there's no climax, and sometimes it confuses me. So, yeah. Most of you are going to be looking here around the top 3 bands. So, interesting, engaging, completely secure in terms of structure, clear, makes sense, has a climax, but a little bit boring and not particularly well executed. And down here, no climax, but it makes sense. And then if it just doesn't make any sense at all, you're down here. But none of you guys have ever written a story for me where it's made no sense whatsoever, so I don't think we need to worry about that. Then you get a mark out of 15, which is for style and accuracy. Basically, vocabulary and grammar. So to get between 13 and 15 marks, you need to have precise, well-chosen vocabulary. So you need to have some interesting vocabulary, some adult vocabulary in your writing, and it needs to make sense because the vocabulary isn't precise if it's very sophisticated but it makes no sense in the story, or if, for example, it's very, very scientific language but you're writing a story. So your language should be more poetic and beautiful than scientific, so it needs to be precise. You need to have lots of different sentence structures chosen for effect. So you need to have some long, complex sentences with your relative and dependent clauses. You need to be varying the way you start your sentence, so don't always begin the sentence with I. And have some short sentences there too, so that you've got that variety. So well-chosen register suitable for context. Register means the tone, how formal or informal you are. So basically, like I was saying before, your register should sound like you're writing a story. If you're writing a scary story, it should be a scary narrative register, and it shouldn't sound like you're writing a scientific report. And then spelling, punctuation, and grammar is almost always accurate. Notice almost always, you don't need to be 100% perfect, but if you're 96% perfect, you can get up here. 10 to 12 is where we usually tend to be in our class, and that means that you've got mostly precise vocabulary and a range of sentences mostly for effect. So it's this idea of mostly, so maybe 85% correct, but there are some errors. So we need to be getting it just a little bit more perfect to get into the top band. When I was marking for the exam, most students would tend to get in this band. I think we do quite a bit better than average actually in our class. but this is what they tend to do. So there's some precise vocabulary, but actually their vocabulary is usually quite plain. It's quite childish. It's not very exciting. It's a lot of repetition of the same words, and the sentence structures just tend to be the same over and over again. It sometimes sounds like a story, but sometimes doesn't. And it's generally accurate, but there's some errors. So a big thing with CIE is sentencing, whether or not your sentences are accurate. And what that means mainly is that you can use full stops correctly. A really common error is to put a comma when it should be a full stop. And sometimes I found that students at our school can do that a little bit more, because in Chinese you guys use commas where we would use full stops. So it's a little bit of a different concept in the two languages that sometimes causes some confusion. If you're one of those people, make sure that you revise comma splices, because a comma splice using a comma when it should be a full stop is classed by CIE really as a serious error. So if you're doing that a lot, and by that I mean more than 8 times, you're not going to be able to get much higher than this. So yeah. So make sure that you summarise now my points about the mark scheme. What do you need to do to get into the top band? What kinds of tricks and tips did I give you? Next, we are going to read the example stories, and you are going to decide what mark they would get and why. So, I've given you guys this PDF, CIE example stories. I'd recommend that you pause the video now to read those stories, and then we'll go over it. So you need to read the stories and decide what mark they would get and why. So let's think about the story that was called Retribution. And I'll just read out a short extract from it, not the whole story. Make sure that you have read the whole story though. Royal red blood oozed out of my stomach, staining my milk-white shirt. Gasping for air, I struggled to drag my own heavy body away from the crash. Using my right arm to drag myself along the ice-cold pavement, whilst using my left to prevent excessive blood loss, I looked behind at the devastating wreckage. My head began to hurt and my vision blurred. Don't give up. Keep going. Fight the pain, I deliberately muttered to myself. So have a look and think, what grade do you think this example got and why? What mark would you give it for content, and what mark would you give it for accuracy? So CIE say that it should get a 7 out of 10. So if we go back to our mark scheme, you can see that a 7 would put it here. So it's in the second band, but it's at the bottom of the second band. So they say, although at times the narrative could be considered slightly incredible, the candidate has created a story which can be considered to be generally engaging and effective. So, although the story is a little bit unrealistic, a little bit unbelievable, the story is overall engaging and effective. The characters are successfully characterised and the plot is developed to reach an appropriate and effective climax. So we've got a sense of character and there is a climax. This here is clearly a climax, right? This person passing out. There is some good management of the structure choices, such as changes in timescale for deliberate effect, interesting details to engage the reader, such as establishing the importance of the dog in the narrator's life followed by its subsequent death, demonstrates that this character understands how fiction works. So the fact that the writer has made you care about the dog before they then kill the dog shows that they understand that they need to have an effect on the reader and give that character a motivation, right? So this is a pretty good piece of writing, but it's not in the top band because it is a little bit unrealistic. So for style and accuracy, this has got a 9 out of 15, so quite a bit lower. So that means that it's in this band 4 here, which, as I said before, is quite an average band for people to get. at least in the exam. I think they probably get a higher mark in the coursework because they have a chance to edit. So CIE say, the candidate uses vocabulary with some precision, so there's some good vocabulary, as well as using a range of sentence structures for effect. For example, the final sentence. This here, don't give up, keep going, fight the pain, ... shows that they're trying to use that sentence structure to show the pain that he's in, to show that he's passing out. It's quite a deliberate choice of sentence structure. Spelling, punctuation and grammar are generally accurate, although there are some issues with tenses and punctuation. It is likely that these issues could have been remedied, could have been fixed by careful proofreading. So it says that although it sometimes fits the higher band, because it's got too many errors, that it would be more appropriate to give it top of level 4. So notice that if your work is sometimes here and sometimes here, the examiner will need to make a judgment. Is this person bottom of band 5 or top of band 4? And they will give you the band that they think best fits your piece of work. And it's sometimes hard to argue with that because it's a little bit subjective, it's a little bit personal, right? Next we're going to have a look at the example of The Dark Knight, so make sure that you've read this example before you watch my explanation of what mark it would get and why. So I recommend that you pause the video here and have a read of that first. Let's just read a short extract from it then. I hear my voice. Someone is calling me from somewhere far. I open my eyes. The room was dark. I look at the clock. It was 2 a.m. It was dark outside, cloudy and cold. I could hear the wind brushing the leaves. I had a feeling something is wrong. I decided to go downstairs to have a look on what's going on. I opened the door of my room and I heard the low sound footsteps of someone walking slowly. I took my bat and quietly walked downstairs only to see no one was in my house. The doors were closed, nothing looked stole or touched, but there was still the feeling of someone watching me. So have a think. Firstly, is this one better or worse than the story that we just read? And what grade would you give this example and why? What mark would you give it for content and what mark would you give it for accuracy? So hopefully you have picked up on the fact that this is just quite evidently a worse piece of writing than the first one. If we just start off with style and accuracy, you can see that there are a lot of errors with this piece of writing, and the first one that jumps out to me is that the sentencing is insecure. The sentencing is not correct. There's a lot of errors with misusing commas, not using full stops, and lots of run-on sentences when the sentences just become one big sentence. Let me point out some of that to you. I opened my eyes, the room was dark. That there should be 2 separate sentences, right? So you should really put a full stop there and a capital letter, or join them up with a conjunction. I opened my eyes, but the room was dark. I looked at the clock, it was 2 a.m. Same thing again. There is another comma splice. I might put a colon there to join them. It was dark outside, cloudy and cold. That there is supposed to be an extra clause, so it needs a comma. I could hear the wind brushing the leaves. I had a feeling something is wrong. So then the next thing that I'm noticing is the tenses. This piece of writing is switching between past and present tense. Look here, we've got present tense here. Present tense is. But then we've got past tense, the room was dark. Past tense, I looked outside. Past tense, it was. And then down here, something is wrong. So the tense is super insecure. It switches all the way through and it makes it really confusing. The next thing I want you to notice is that all of the sentences are quite simple, they're quite short, and they usually begin the same way. It's quite repetitive. I. Right? This repetition of I did this, it's very boring to the reader, and it makes it sound kind of, I don't want to say dumb, it just makes it sound not very sophisticated when you're reading it. So make sure that your sentences start in different ways and that they've got different structures, that you might have a long sentence with a relative clause followed by a shorter sentence that's just a simple declarative, that you're using these different types of sentences to vary up, because if your sentences all begin the same way, it makes your reader a little bit too aware of the fact that they're reading a piece of writing. Like it makes them forget that they're in this special world, and it just makes them think, hang on, I'm reading a piece of writing here, and it's actually quite badly written. So CIE, yeah, they've not given it a terribly good mark. They've given it a 3 out of 10 for content. So if we go here, that means that it's here. 3 out of 10. Straightforward, briefly developed, not always effective, straightforward, limited use of features of narrative writing. I'm thinking about buying a cat. So it's straightforward, a safe structure, it has paragraphs, and it has some relevant details. There is some plot, but it's simple, and you always understand it, it's clear. There's some attempt to develop ideas, some attempt to develop tension, but it's just not successful. Overall, the structure is limited, it's quite childish, it tries to do some of the things, it's obvious what the person means, but it's just boring and unsuccessful. So it gets a 3 out of 10. For style and accuracy then, so I've already put this one on blast for its many, many mistakes, and it gets a 5 out of 15. So that will be here on band 3. Simple vocabulary, simple sentence structures, simple register, frequent errors of spelling, punctuation and grammar, occasionally serious. Yeah. So that occasionally serious is referring mainly to the sentencing, I would hesitate to guess. So the story consists of 7 paragraphs which begin very similarly and consist of a range of mostly straightforward sentences that provide order and sequence. So we've got a simple paragraph, simple sentences, quite repetitive. Where the candidate tries to employ a more complex sentence structure, there are errors. So when they try to do something more complicated, it's just wrong. Vocabulary is safe, like it makes sense, it's clear, but it does not try to be complex, it does not try to be interesting. The register is almost mechanical in nature, and it's very simplistic. Spelling is accurate, but there are lots of frequent errors with punctuation and grammar that do not affect meaning but hinder the flow when reading. So I always understand what this person means, but when I'm reading it, I'm focusing on those errors. It's making me go mistake, 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 and so I don't enjoy the story. So that is an example of what a 5 out of 15 would look like, and overall this piece of writing gets 8 out of 25. So there is an example, please, class, of what not to do. Finally, we are going to have a look at example 3, which is called The Shell and the Glasses. So, once again, please pause this screen and read that story before we continue. Okay, let's read just this one example paragraph together. So it says, the door gave with slight pressure, though screeched in protest as its hinges reached their limit. The man stepped into the dimly lit room with a crunch of paper under his bare foot. He surveyed the place wearily, picking up the scents of must and damp which clung to his nostrils. A small click at his heel nudged a set of keys with a second step into the abode. The man was blatantly exhausted. He could be handsome, though, perhaps. It was the sheer sobriety of the situation that made him seem ancient, ashen, lacking in all cheery ruggedness. It just seemed to correct for this man to have possessed, blah, blah, blah. I don't think I read that out terribly fluently then. Have a think then, what grade do you think that this got? What mark did it get for content, and what mark did it get for accuracy? So, Probably you've guessed that this is the best one, and it actually got 10 out of 10 full marks for content and structure. So it says it's complex and engaging as a piece of writing. The features of fiction writing are clearly evident in the way which convincing and realistic characters are created through the use of dialogue, actions and thought. So when it's talking about those extra details, CIE judges their dialogue, actions and thought, so really understanding the motivation of your characters is sufficient for top band. The structure is secure and well balanced and skillfully moves the reader between the past and present to build to a thought-provoking and interesting end. So it's got a interesting climax and interesting end. And also notice that it plays with structure. So you've not just got this straightforward linear narrative where you go from the present into the future in order, chronological. It's flipping between past and present with flashbacks, right? And that would make it a more complicated piece of writing. For style and accuracy, so it says, the candidate consistently demonstrates an ability to use vocabulary with precision and deliberate effect. So I completely agree with that. If we have a look at some of the excellent vocabulary, we've got screeched, we've got dimly lit, we've got the crunch of the paper under his bare foot, we've got must, we've got clung, we've got sheer sobriety is a very nice phrase indeed, ruggedness, possessed, ashen. All of these words are very precise, they're very effective in the context, they're sophisticated, they're interesting words to read. So then it also says that the reflective and thoughtful register is convincing, which adds to the enjoyment of the piece and demonstrates that the candidate has a secure understanding of the chosen genre. So the overall tone of the piece is very convincing. Spelling, punctuation and grammar are almost always accurate. So it gets 15 out of 15. So once again, to get 15 out of 15 marks, you can make some very small errors and you can still get 15 out of 15. But it's more about this overall effect of your vocabulary, your tone, your sentences. Those are the things that really stand out to the examiner. So can you please summarise what you have learned by looking at those examples? So finish off these sentences and post them into your team's group. In order to get a high score for content and structure, I need to examples from the text I read today include, and then for style and accuracy, and post these on your team's private channel, please. Overall, what I want you to take away is these are the things that CIE really care about from looking at the examples that they've given us, from looking at the mark scheme, and also from my own knowledge examining for them. These are the things that we would usually focus on. Number one is you need to have a clear, understandable plot. That's like the basic thing. If your plot isn't clear, if I don't understand what's happening, you're going to get a bad mark. To get that higher mark, it needs to be engaging and effective. Your story has to have a climax. It has to be clear, it has to be effective, it has to have an impact on the reader. You need to have a sense of setting. So what place does it take in? What time does it take in? If you're doing like a different universe, then those rules of your universe should be clear too. You need to have characterization. So who are your characters? What do they look like? What do they care about? What motivates them? How do they talk? Those little details to creating a realistic character are really important, especially if you want to get the top band. In terms of grammar, you need to be fluent. So there needs to be no tense errors, no awkward phrasing in order to get a higher mark. Vocabulary is incredibly important. You need to have a range of sophisticated vocabulary that's precise and effective in your story. And you need to have few punctuation errors, especially with comma splices. So if you're making a lot of sentencing errors and not using full stops correctly or using commas when you should be using full stops, that is a really serious mistake that we need to correct now. So finally, for this assessment, for this piece of coursework, you are going to be able to choose your own assignment. So I've given you some idea questions that I'm going to show you in a second, but if you have got a story of your own that you want to write, then you can ignore all of these and write whatever you want to write. Basically, this is up to you. I want you to use your imagination and write a story that excites you. But here are some examples of things that you could write. Write a story that includes the line, "and he must live with that feeling forever." So the line could be at the start, middle, end, wherever. But the story at some point has to include that phrase, "and he must live with that feeling forever." Write about a character whose world is dying. Write about how the birth rate has dropped significantly, so much so that now children are worth millions. Write a story that includes these words: tagged, chipped, and shuffled into line. Write a story with the title, "The Unopened Door." Write a story about how and why your character woke up in a stranger's home. Nothing dirty or yellow, please. Write a story about how children are the future. So those are some example story ideas, some example prompts, but as I said, feel free to ignore them if you've got a really good idea of your own. So I want you please to start thinking about what you're going to write, start getting some inspiration. A reminder that you're going to need to summarise my points about the mark scheme, read the example stories, decide what mark they get and why. Please post this on your team's group channel. And this is a personal one. Pick a story idea and begin thinking about what you will write. Okay, that's it. I hope you enjoyed that. I'm going to have to go and get swabbed now to see whether or not I've got the coronavirus. So that'll be fun. Hopefully I've not got it. If not, I guess I'll see you guys in a month when I'm back from hospital. Yeah, just joking. Anyway, I hope that this was somewhat useful to you, and talk soon. Bye bye.